Yo, it's episode 225 Radio Free Innsmouth. This week talking about a Japanese band. I know we missed a week on the alternating schedule, whatever. But this band's called Dead End. They were mostly active in the 80s and they were massively influential. Encoded within the second half of that statement, the whole massively influential part, is the reason why I feel like they're an interesting band to talk about. Because they were influential in a weird way. I mean, on one hand, they influenced a lot of metal bands. Specifically, Yoshiki from X-Japan says that a big part of his drumming was influenced by what Dead End were doing. But then a lot of the other bands that are referencing Dead End as an influence, they play visual K, but they're not really metal at all. I mean, you got stuff like L'Arc-en-Ciel, who played this really sparkling poppy variety of post-punk in the early 90s. It does have really good guitar playing, but it's not metal in any way, shape, or form outside of maybe more guitar solos than you'd be used to for this kind of music. I mean, I like it a lot, but it is kind of surprising that a band that sounds like this is citing an old school 80s heavy metal band as a major influence. You'd think they'd be talking about Joy Division or The Police or something, but no, they're like, we fucking love Dead End. And then there's Lacrima Christi, who are definitely more in the progressive rock, 70s retro revival rock category than anything metal. The guitar riffs are a little bit more muscular than they are in L'Arc-en-Ciel. I love saying that. But you really still wouldn't argue that this is anything even approaching metal. But you ask them what their influences are, you think they're gonna say like Cheap Trick or whatever. No, they're in the Dead End. I mean, it's just weird. It'd be like if the guy from like Screaming Trees started talking about how much he loved Grim Reaper or like Angel Witch or something. It's just not what you would expect. And even with the fact that they're not really that metal at all, both of those bands, L'Arc-en-Ciel and Lacrima Christi, they don't really sound that alike. They do have one common element though, and that is in their complex guitar playing. And if you have that in the back of your head, the Dead End thing starts to make a little bit more sense, because Dead End were perhaps the ultimate practitioner of what I would like to call the multi-segmented heavy metal riff.
어플로 주문을 하던가?
I mean, that would be the operative question, right? What the hell is a multi-segmented heavy metal riff? I'm just out there inventing these terms and using them like people know what they mean. Well,
to be honest with you, I'm kind of retarded.
But I swear this one actually makes sense, folks. So let's say you have your standard heavy metal guitar riff. It is the building block from which all things come in this genre of music. But one of the great innovations to this unit of construction that came about in the 80s was this sort of multi-segmented, multifaceted version of it, where you might have sort of like a central backbone to the riff, but then at the tail end of each section of it, it has different interchangeable parts that could be swapped around, resulting in a more complex form of music. A good example of this would be the classic Ozzy song, Bark at the Moon.
Rock and roll, motherfucker! Woo!
Settle down, baby.
Which features sort of a very prominent backbone section of the riff, sort of a skeleton, if you will. But then to the end of that musical phrase, you can add all sorts of weird guitar tomfoolery. So first time around, here's the backbone, here's the tomfoolery. That weird unorthodox usage of intervals again. Here comes the backbone again. But that time he does a weird little palm muty trick with a bit of an arpeggio in it. And it is by utilizing this mode of composition that you can take metal from just kind of bashing out singular repetitive riffs into a much more structurally complex arena that is essentially a modern day rediscovery of the Baroque concept of the fugue. Where you have all of these intricately related musical parts kind of arcing over each other and blending into one another. Another good example of this that's perhaps a little bit closer to what Dead End are about would be Dokken. Intro section, backbone right here, and then here's the weird tail with that little interval trick. Tail comes around again. and that time it's a very cleanly played, palm-muted, arpeggiated melody. Another band that did that quite a bit was Loudness. Loudness also utilized a lot of sort of like not standard for punk or hard rock intervals in the way they structured chords. And Dead End does both of those things quite a bit as well. If you want to hear more about the interval stuff, listen to the Loudness episode because it's pretty complicated. But Dead End essentially picks up with what bands like Jake E. Lee era Ozzy or Dokken or Loudness are doing and really ups the complexity with it. So we finally get to talk about Dead End. Kind of.
안녕, 나는 총무부장이야.
Look, I promise this shit's important. We've been talking about guitar stuff a lot, right? Dead End is pretty much the brainchild of the guitarist Yu Odachi. But he didn't start out with Dead End. So back in the 80s, with a lot of these more visually inclined heavy metal bands over in Japan, there was sort of a wacky thing going on where they would take purposefully controversial names. We're talking about bands like Mein Kampf and Rosenfeld and Rommel. Well, Yu Odachi goes even weirder. He just straight up calls his band
Jesus H. Christ.
He's in a band that's just straight up called Jesus. And what's interesting about this is they only put out one demo. It's pretty highly sought after by J-metal collectors. And he actually brought a song from this demo session to the more well-known band Terra Rosa when he joined them for a little bit right before their first album before he left and then started up Dead End. And even at this early stage, you can hear him utilizing his signature riffing style based around that whole multi-segmented approach with lots of wacky tricks dancing around inside bar chords, utilizing artificial harmonics, little neoclassical fills. But honestly, I prefer the album version from Terra Rosa, sorry.
Oh dear, I seem to have spotted a cunt. Good day.
And I swear, it's not just because the production's better. I mean, it is way better than it is in that hissy-ass tape demo. But one of the main standouts for Terra Rosa for me is how complex they are, and a lot of that complexity comes from the heavily integrated keyboard stuff. Well, that and the fact that Kazue Akao is such an awesome vocalist.
I know what you're thinking.
These vocals sound effeminate as fuck. Well,
Gotcha, bitch.
that's because it's a chick on vocals, dummy, and she's great. I really need to do a Terra Rosa episode at some point, because, man... Because, man, they're a badass band. Shoutouts to Anonymous Euronymous 1349 for recommending them to me in the comment section of the Heavy Metal Army episode 2 months ago. And while, yeah, it would have been kind of funny for a band just called Jesus to get really popular, and it honestly would have been kind of cool if Yu Adachi had stayed with Terra Rosa. Terra Rosa did fine without him, and him leaving meant that he got to start up his band Dead End, which is fucking great. The first two Dead End albums are very dark, gothic, old school heavy metal. Full of that multi-segmented riff composition and the weird intervals that I've been talking about so much. That shit's all over. He's a great guitarist. And Mori Otsuka is one hell of a distinctive vocalist. He's sort of the Japanese Ronnie James Dio. He's very rough and growly, grumbly around the edges, but he can also bring some smoothness to it in the pre-chorus. This guy's distinctive vocal approach was honestly almost as much of an influence in the larger Japanese scene in and outside of metal as Yu's guitar playing was. Songwriting on these first two Dead End albums is outstanding heavy metal artistry. They'll do a lot of cool stuff like this where they completely invert the intro riff of the song into something completely new to open up into in the chorus. This kind of demonstrates a point I was making earlier where there's sort of a natural continuation of loudness, upping the complexity. And the solos are great, very neoclassical, Yngwie adjacent type shit. If you like old school power metal, you'll love it. Speaking of loudness, you want to hear you get really nuts with the weird intervals? This one's called Phantom Nation. It's probably the darkest and strangest song on their second album. It's got a whole lot of sections and weird transitions, like this one, for instance, right here. That's some fucking Watchtower shit, dude. And then check out this guitar shit right here. This is crazy. Utilizing clean guitar inside a very nasty distorted guitar riff. Not even just clean guitar, acoustic guitar inside the distorted riff. That's interesting. If you were ever thinking, man, I like loudness, but they're just not weird enough for me, that's when you get into bands like fucking Dead End. I mean, obviously, yeah, they're playing heavy metal, but they're playing old school heavy metal as if it was written by Coroner or something, with all these strange chord choices and convoluted song structures. If you're a regular old school heavy metal purist, you'll definitely get the most out of the first two Dead End albums. But they didn't stop at just making weird heavy metal on those first two. Once you get to the third and fourth Dead End albums, they get even more bizarre, and you start to really see how these guys not only influenced a whole lot of heavy metal bands, but a whole lot of bands that didn't even play metal. They just like doing weird shit with instruments. The third Dead End album, it's probably tied with that second Dead End album, Ghost of Romance, as far as being my favorite, but it's by far their strangest album. It probably should be entitled Shambhala, but they kinda the English, so it's Shambhala.
Racism can be pretty funny.
They kept the weird H.R. Giger-esque album art style, but they ditched, that Miami Vice-ass logo all like... in favor of a newer, classier design with a crescent moon in it that has kind of become the standard logo calling card for the band. They also kind of bifurcated their sound into two different halves, because a decent chunk of this album is sort of like Dead End's weirdo take on 80s hard rock, with very catchy mid-paced riffs spiced up with their singular, angular, odd note choices, and a whole lot of negative space so they can throw in weird little fill-in bits like this one right here. That was pretty fucking neat. There's a heavy emphasis on groove, which is amplified by a much louder bass and drum presence. The cool thing about these multi-segmented riff segments is when you get into the vocal sections, you can pull notes out of them while still maintaining integrity of the song and allowing the vocals to shine. Very nicely done, weird 80s hard rock that has enough complexity to it to make it interesting listening for a metalhead. Speaking of those vocals, check out these weird back-end vocals coming up here. That's not something you're going to hear outside of a Japanese band. It was like the ghost of CCR invaded the studio. Or maybe a demonically possessed iteration of Guns N' Roses. Whatever it is, I like it. The lead guitar also drops a little bit of the neoclassicism in favor of this really weird, sliding, odd, bluesy style. It reminds me a lot of the change in style between the second Crimson Glory album and the third one. It's almost an entirely new genre of music, but they're doing a really good job at it. But that's only one half of the equation of this album. The other one is a direct continuation of the really weird gothic heavy metal they were doing on Ghost of Romance, but taken into an odd sort of like tribal territory. When Yoshiki from X Japan says he was really inspired by the drumming going on in 80s Dead End stuff, I gotta think he's talking about songs like this. I mean, just listen to those crazy tom rolls.
I'm hearing a lot of strange stuff.
Vocals on this album are also a lot more smoother and emotive, not as nasty and snarling, but it fits the material. And the really layered, like wacky guitar parts, you can see how this would influence stuff like Lacrima Christi a whole lot. This kind of sparkly sheen to the layers of riffs is all over 90s J-rock stuff, and it pretty much starts with Dead End on this album. I love the drumming on this track in particular. It's so fucking smooth, despite being really weird and almost polyrhythmic at times. Unsurprisingly, the album that comes out after this one really scales back most of the heavy metal in favor of this weird kind of proggy stuff, but again, they do a good job of it. The fourth Dead End album came out in 1989 entitled Zero. It's not really terribly heavy, but it's one of the prettiest albums I've ever heard, especially in a heavy metal context. You can definitely hear how this kind of stuff might have influenced some of the more consonant moments in X-Japan's 90s material, in addition to bands like L'Arc-en-Ciel and Lacrima Christi, of course. For an 80s album from an 80s band, quite a bit of this sounds very, very fucking 90s. The vocals are almost entirely smoothed out, and a lot of times I kind of wish they just stuck to singing in Japanese because the lyrics are like silly love song shit. But musically, Zero is a solid fucking album and an excellent way to cap off the 80s and to honestly cap off Dead End's career, because they didn't do much for years and years after this album came out. Everybody kind of faded into other bands and side projects and shit. In the early 2000s, there was a bit of a reunion that put out 2 albums that I haven't heard yet.
Oh, busted.
But I can definitely vouch for the quality of their 80s material. Unfortunately, Yu Adachi passed away in 2020 from sepsis. Ugh. So that's a pretty big loss for the wacky metal guitar playing community. But you can still get all these Dead Ed albums, and they're great if you don't mind paying steep ass Japanese import prices. But yeah, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. See you next time with more stuff.
Bye bye.
You know what's gross? Your face.